Did you know that Kaido was a child soldier who wanted to awaken Joy Boy? Or how about that Crocodile and Flamingo actually had the same evil master plan? Well, that's just the beginning about all there is to know about the most evil collection of people in all of anime, because today we're going to explain the powers, plans, and past of every main villain in One Piece. Starting with Luffy's first antagonist in the series, who was the self-proclaimed most beautiful pirate on the seas and Kobe's captor, Alvida. Now, she was feared by regular people and her crew members alike, but she was no match for Luffy, of course. And then a little later, the smooth fruit made her as beautiful as she thought she was, as she became one of Buggy's top subordinates. And after fighting a fellow pirate, the antagonist of Shell's Town showed One Piece readers that pirates weren't the only bad ones out there, because the Marines who are supposed to enforce justice could be just as corrupt as pirates, if not worse. It's only that their violence is justified by the government. And so Captain Morgan ruled Shell's Town with an iron fist, or axe, I guess that is, erecting statues to himself and extracting huge taxes from the citizens. However, his reign was brought to an end once and for all once Luffy crushed his statue and Zoro crushed him. Next up, at the time of his introduction, Buggy the Clown seemed like just another villain of the week. However, this clown is no joke, because in reality, he is one of the most important characters in the entire series somehow. Because you see, just like Blackbeard, in a way Buggy also is a sort of reflection of Luffy. He's the very first fellow devil fruit user that Luffy ever fights against, having eaten the chop fruit. He also has a history with Shanks, with both of them being actual cabin boys on the Pirate King's crew. However, much unlike Luffy, Buggy at some point seems to have given up on his dreams and ambitions. As a result, he now terrorizes the East Blue, the weakest of the seas, and as if to say that Luffy's dream is foolish, he even stabs through the Straw Hat himself. However, after his time as a villain in Orange Town, Buggy then began failing continuously upwards. First, he became Luffy's reluctant ally in Impel Down, and after breaking free of the prison, was actually named a warlord with a ton of escapees becoming his followers. And eventually, he even climbed all the way to the heights of the pirate world and was named as one of the 4 emperors at the same time as Luffy, forming the Cross Guild along with 2 other former warlords, Mihawk and Crocodile. However, it was then that we found out that Buggy's character was actually a lot more complex than we thought. In reality, though he told himself for years it was impossible, deep down he actually does dream of claiming the One Piece himself and intends to try to accomplish this with the power of Cross Guild, much to Crocodile's and Mihawk's dismay. And so, as shocking as that might seem, Buggy is a lot more than just comic relief, and he has a major role to actually play in the final saga of One Piece. Like, you know, when he's inevitably gonna claim the One Piece himself and become king of the pirates. On the other hand, Captain Kudo of the Black Hat Pirates himself hardly deserves to call himself even a pirate. In a bit of a comfortable retirement, he hid his identity and tried to swindle Kaya and her family out of her inheritance. In reality, he actually had plans to kill her as well as terrorize the rest of Syrup Village. Plus, he of course also teaches all of us to always be very wary of people who wear glasses / cat boys. And actually, almost like a preview of certain string-pulling villains yet to come, he preferred to work in secret from the shadows. He's a planner and a manipulator rather than working towards his goals head-on. And of course, he stood in direct opposition to the dreams of Luffy and Usopp to be adventurous and fun-loving pirates. Next up, Don Krieg is the anime version of the story if you gave a mouse a cookie, because once Sanji fed him, he tried to take the entire restaurant literally. And Krieg basically continues the trend of cunning and manipulative villains who are willing to step on their own crewmates to achieve their own goals. However, unlike Kudo's long con, Don Krieg prefers to back up his will with the best tools and weaponry that money can buy you. He fights insanely dirty and underhanded, using hidden artillery and poisonous gas to try to defeat his opponents. However, of course, no matter how many resources he actually acquires, whether it's weapons or a massive armada, he wasn't quite cut out for the Grand Line. fine. And then Luffy of course shows him through his fists, I guess, that only tenacity, bravery, and true strength can really cut it when it comes to actual piracy. But of course, the most fearsome opponent that Luffy actually met in the East Blue was Arlong, because this shark fisherman was once a proud member of the Sun Pirates under the famous Fisher Tiger. However, unlike Jinbei, instead of actually fighting for the liberation of the fishermen, he just fled the Grand Line to flip houses, but not in the HDTV way, you know. He flips houses in an extremely literal way. He proclaimed the supremacy of fishermen by using his superior strength to make the people of Kokoyashi Village, Nami's village, live in true fear, forcing them to pay for their very own lives. However, as it turned out later on, Arlong demonstrates a quite complicated depiction of racial discrimination. Because later, his terrible actions were contextualized when we learned that he'd spent a lifetime facing terrible prejudice at the hands of humans in his turn. And his character basically shows how hatred and violence only creates a vicious cycle of even more hatred and violence. But of course, his year-long torment of Nami also made Luffy's most personal fight in the story yet. Of course, he didn't know the exact details of Nami's past, but her tears showed him everything that he needed to know, and he made Arlong pay for real for causing pain to someone he cared about. Next up, in Loketown, the final main villain of the East Blue Saga was Smoker. And if Accent Morgan earlier showed us an example of how corrupt the Marines were, well, the introduction of Captain Smoker here showed us that there are actually some good apples in the Marines as well, after all. Despite his quite gruff exterior and a double cigar habit, which, by the way, insane, he's ultimately a quite kind person at heart. After all, mean people's pants do hate ice cream. Now, Smoker here genuinely believes that pirates are a real danger to the world, and when he sees Luffy on the executioner's stand, he's the first Marine to take him seriously as a threat to the world government, and a real contender to eventually become Pirate King. At this point in the story, he truly believes in the mission of the Marines, and when he is at odds with it, well, then screw what the higher-ups were actually saying, he'll do things the way that he wants to. That's of course why later on in Alabasta, and then way later on Punk Hazard, he's actually found himself as Luffy's reluctant ally instead of actually achieving his goal of bringing him to justice. On top of that, Smoker is also the very first person in the story to actually introduce us to the concept of Logia fruits with his Smoke fruit, making him completely untouchable by Luffy. And actually, speaking of the Alabasta saga, the next major villain that Luffy meets along the way is the corrupt king with a case of the munchies, Walpole. Now, even though Walpole is the villain of Chopper's arc, he really works as a kind of contrast to Princess Vivi here. Because these two share a past together at the Reverie, and then later on at another Reverie, well, these two monarchs would be brought together again in a quite big way. Now, of course, whereas Vivi is a ruler who truly cares for her people above all else, Walpole believes that his kingdom, well, basically exists only to serve at his own pleasure. He has a monopoly on all of the resources in the kingdom, including the doctors, and rules with an iron or a Walpole metal fist. His greed, or maybe I should say gluttony, is represented perfectly by his Munch devil fruit that lets him gobble up everything and use it for himself. In other words, he's just pretty awful, but now that Walpole has uncovered the troubling truth of the world government, well, who knows what's in store next for the corrupt king. Does seem like he might be joining the good guys, even if unwillingly. Which, you know, begins to seem like a bit of a pattern here. Now, moving to Alabasta, Sir Crocodile is the first warlord that Luffy ever has to fight against. And once again, he follows the trend of the quite cunning and manipulative villains in the One Piece world by leading the shadowy organization called Baroque Works. And in this organization, no one knows the real identities of the executives of the organization, and none of the subordinates suspect that its leader is actually one of the 7 warlords. After all, the warlords are supposed to be these glorified dogs of the government and not acting against it to overthrow an entire government. In a nutshell, through sabotaging the kingdom of Alabasta, he paints himself as a savior of the people in his master plan to claim the kingdom, as well as the ancient weapon that he believes is hidden there. And when the Straw Hats finally track him down to his lair in Rain Base, he gives off big Bond villain vibes with his trapdoor leading to a pit of banana-gators. He is quite cruel to the people of Alabasta and his own employees alike as he enacts elaborate plans for his own gains. Of course, his sand powers fit in completely perfectly with his plan to turn Alabasta upside down by robbing the country of its water supply. Basically, he wants to dry everything up and make it lifeless so that the people will despair, allowing him to easily overthrow the government and take power into his own hands and his hook. Now, nowadays, Crocodile is racked on by power scalers for losing to a pre-time skip Luffy, but at the time of the Alabasta arc, Crocodile was on a quite different level from anything that Luffy had faced before. For one, his Logi abilities allowed him to nearly kill Luffy twice, and if it hadn't been for Nico Robin's betrayal, he probably would have succeeded. And then once Crocodile reappeared in Impel Down and the Summit War, he actually surprised all of us by once again becoming Luffy's ally. Rather than holding his personal grudges, he knew that it was to his own benefit to set the past aside in order to seize his chance in order to escape and to take a stab at killing Whitebeard. Now, of course, we still have things to learn about his mysterious past, such as the secret that Ivankov knows about him, and we're sure to learn more now that he's actually created the Cross-Guild organization along with Buggy and Mihawk. Oh, yeah, and I forgot, he's of course also Luffy's mother. Next up, Bellamy sprang into action as the main antagonist of the Jaya arc. The Skypiea saga was a story all about chasing after your wildest dreams, in a series all about chasing after your wildest dreams. Until Bellamy the Hyena, a subordinate of Doflamingo, however, thought that the era of pirates dreaming were over and that Luffy was laughable for wanting to go to a sky island or even find the One Piece. As a result, he then got a fist-sized dent in his face as a thank you. However, once again staying in line with Luffy converting former enemies into allies, eventually he would come around to Luffy's way of thinking. He would go on to see Sky Island for himself and climb the ranks of Doflamingo's crew, only to find out that the warlord was just using him like a puppet on a string, sometimes extremely literally. Nowadays, however, he is actually retired from the pirate life to become a dyer of pirate flags. And after that, One Piece just goes from 0 to 100 real quick because the next villain is God. Or at least someone who thinks that they're God. But Enel might as well be a god given the sense that his observation haki makes him omniscient across Skypiea and his lightning powers can one-shot just about any character that doesn't happen to be made of, well, rubber. In fact, Enel's lightning abilities have made him so untouchable that he's truly let his powers get to his head, giving him one of the most inflated egos in the entire series, which truly is saying something. And yeah, he actually does believe that he is a god. Luffy had already toppled kings and warlords, so god just, seems like the next logical step here. And funnily enough, much later, well, we would actually find out that Luffy himself has the powers of an actual god and that his devil fruit was actually the sun god Nika fruit. And so funnily enough, that reveal during the Wano arc would reframe so much of what we saw in that Skypiea arc. From the first time that we saw the now infamous Nika pose and the first reference to a sun god in the Nolan flashback, but it also turned the battle between Luffy and Enel into a real struggle between a true god of freedom and liberation and a false idol who used his powers to torment the innocent people of the Sky Islands. But now for maybe the most diabolical villain of the entire One Piece series, Foxy the Silver Fox, and he of course serves the important role of one of the villains needing to be a silly little guy, and he introduces us to the concept of the Davy backfight, which will probably be important later. Maybe. Probably, we think. Definitely important, and also on Long Ring Long Island though, we also meet another antagonist who is a lot more intimidating than Foxy, and that's the Marine Admiral Aokiji. Now, if it hadn't been for Luffy's grandpa Garp being Aokiji's personal mentor, he could have easily taken out the entire Straw Hat crew then and there. He freezes Robin and Luffy completely through and easily could have shattered them in a million pieces if it hadn't been for his conscience convincing him otherwise. And actually, Admiral Aokiji, or Kuzan if we're using his real name, is quite a lot like Smoker. Even though he's one of the highest officers within the Marines, he's swayed by his own sense of justice. He saved Robin as a child and chose to spare the Straw Hats despite them being wanted by the government at this point. And he even wanted to take the Marines in a new direction and challenged Akainu for the position of Fleet Admiral after the war, but once he lost, he left the Marines to follow his own path and inexplicitly became a member of Blackbeard's crew. But then during the Enies Lobby saga, the Straw Hats find themselves at odds with ZP9, the government's secret spy agency. Now, their strongest member is Rob Luchi, a wielder of the Leopard Zone fruit that gives him immense physical power and abilities. Along with his mastery of the often forgotten 6 powers techniques, he's a quite formidable weapon of the government. And he truly is like a weapon. Luchi might as well be devoid of personality or opinions at this point. He's kind of like a tool to be used for the government's darkest missions. He has been trained for this since his childhood to serve this purpose and executes every mission and criminal and even hostages without any remorse. Basically, he lacks any sense of conscience and follows orders without question because it does give him an excuse to satisfy his own quite twisted bloodlust. And of course, making another comeback on Egghead Island, he actually reveals that he's awakened his Leopard Zone during the time skip, and according to Kaido, an awakening occurs when a Devil Fruit user's will has completely aligned with that of the fruit. Which means, in that case, it makes sense because, like a leopard, Luchi is a real hunter and predator with immense bloodlust. And you know what, I'm just gonna completely ignore what exactly this says about Kaku unlocking his in a giraffe. Because even after Luchi reluctantly teamed up with the Straw Hats to avoid being hunted down by the Seraphim, he was only waiting for his opportunity to once again strike back. However, in my own honest and quite humble opinion though, Luchi is not actually a main villain of One Piece. He's the one that Luffy has to fight at Enies Lobby, but he's not the leader of ZP9. In a sense, the true main villain of Enies Lobby was actually Spandam. And yes, Spandam is a real weakling, having an even lower power level than the average Marine soldier, but since his father was the previous leader of ZP9, well, he kind of nepo baited his way into a position of power here, and he's small-minded and obsessed with revenge, wanting Frankie to suffer after he permanently scarred his face. Honestly, a result that he absolutely deserved after using Frankie's battleships to frame Tom the shipwright for doing it. He's completely incompetent, which is very well evidenced by accidentally calling in a buster call on the Marine and government-run island of Enies Lobby, which he was, by the way, standing on at that time. And I guess it really goes to show you that behind every vicious killing machine is just a petulant daddy's boy with a cool sword. And honestly, I don't really care if we ever get to see Spandam's stupid face again, but please, Oda, let us see Funk Freed again because, like, he's so cool. Let Fun Freak be Zoro's 4th sword. I mean, whatever it takes, please. Meanwhile, the next villain just comes straight out of Tim Burton's Nightmares, who is Gecko Moria. And he's actually now the second warlord that Luffy toppled, and the man is truly washed up. He was actually once a quite prime fighter, but now he's really let himself go, preferring to let his shadows and other henchmen do the work for him. And his power is quite fitting because he's nothing but a shadow of his former self. Get it? That's the way Oda gives these powers. Anyways, they basically allow him to do no work of his own and to just make his zombies do his bidding instead. Now, funnily enough, he actually has a quite tragic backstory, no surprise for a One Piece character, I guess, but once he was actually a quite big shot in the New World, even going toe-to-toe with the likes of Kaido. However, after his entire crew had been killed by the Emperor, his spirit and ambitions were completely broken. And so he decided he wouldn't depend on human allies who could just, die on him anymore, and instead, he'd amass an army of the living dead. Soldiers with no lives to lose so that he could just try to conquer the seas without ever losing another ally again. Sadly, that plan wouldn't really work too well either once Blackbeard's crew killed another one of his allies as well. And on Thriller Bark, we also see Kuma, but in good faith, I can't really call Kuma a villain, and even at this point when he technically was an antagonist, well, nothing really happened. So, onto Sabaody Archipelago, where after Luffy punched a celestial dragon, Admiral Kizaru, or Borsalino, was dispatched to take care of the entire situation. And unlike Aokiji, Kizaru is much more likely to, well, actually follow orders. But he's still kind of at odds with the other Marine admirals who feel very driven, motivated, and purposeful, not so much himself. He has a quite slow manner of speaking and a calm, laid-back demeanor, totally at odds with his literal light fruit, which allows him to move at incomprehensible speeds and deliver light speed kicks and punches. So really, you'd think that having a fruit that embodies light itself would give him a strong sense of good and justice, but instead, Kizaru sees himself as a cog in the machine, going along with the directives from the higher-ups even when he clearly regrets having to do so on a personal level. This actually gets very evident during the Egghead Island arc when he has to fight against his close friends and even people he considers to be like family, like Dr. Vegapunk and Sentomaru or Bonnie. Thankfully though, the Straw Hats didn't end up getting taken out by Kizaru on Sabaody Archipelago and were instead yeeted away by Kuma's paw powers. And Luffy found himself then on Amazon Lily, where Boa Hancock was poised to be a villain, but her status as a villain didn't last very long exactly once she fell head over heels in love with Luffy. And so instead, the Pirate Empress brought Luffy directly to Impel Down, and unfortunately right into the hands of the Warden Magellan. And even though he was demoted after the prison break, this guy seriously has to be one of the most overpowered antagonists in all of One Piece. Heck, even Blackbeard and his crew couldn't do anything to this guy. Everybody had no choice but to run away from his poison. And honestly, if I had to name a reason that Oda gave Magellan the Venom Fruit, that's probably because a prison is a place where criminals go to experience a slow and painful death, and that's pretty much what this Devil Fruit does as well. But even though the man looks like a literal demon, it's kind of hard to be mad at him because, I mean, the dude's just kind of doing his job. I mean, kind of can't blame Magellan for wanting to stop hundreds of really dangerous criminals from escaping. Like, sure, Jimbei doesn't deserve to be locked up, but all of those guys that Blackbeard recruited and Crocodile probably deserve to be in jail. Let's be real. Plus, he's kind of a chill dude, so I mean, let's give him that. But then, of course, after Impel Down, the next villain erupted on the stage at Marineford with Admiral Akainu, though Sasasuke would soon receive a promotion to Fleet Admiral. Now, this powerhouse of the government's military forces has one of the most destructive Devil Fruit powers in the series, the Magma Fruit, befitting of his quite explosive rage and personality. He's a true believer in absolute justice and wants to stop pirates at any cost, no matter how many sacrifices it may take. For instance, he ordered for the evacuation ship at Ohara to be struck down despite it carrying tons of innocent civilians instead of any scholars. He also demanded that his soldiers keep fighting at Marineford long after the battle had finally met its conclusion. And he even threatened to kill any Marines who wanted to retreat until Shanks arrived to put a stop to him. And honestly, out of all the villains in One Piece, he is the one that Luffy holds the greatest grudge against. After all, Akainu killed Ace and left Luffy with a permanent reminder of the experience when he left a giant scar on his chest. Now, when we first meet him, Sakazuki believes in justice at all costs, but after the time skip, cracks do seem to have formed in his worldview a little bit. For one, Garp never became an admiral because he didn't want to work directly under the Celestial Dragons, and as the Fleet Admiral, Sakazuki has repeatedly found his own conscience quite at odds with the 5 Elder Stars. When he finds himself fighting a renegade Kuma atop the Red Line, he wonders where the former warlord could be going, saying, "You've lost your will, your mind, everything, you're just a damn puppet now." But as Akainu reflects himself, it kind of feels as though he's kind of talking just as much about himself as he is about Kuma. And so yeah, even though he might switch sides in the end together with the other admirals, this guy still is a real jerk in my book, no matter what he does. But of course, Akainu isn't the only villain that reared his head during Marineford, because also zehahahaing his own way into the battle was Marshal D. Teach, better known as Blackbeard. And Blackbeard actually hasn't taken the stage as the main villain yet, but he's been a menacing presence presence in the story all the time. So if Akainu is the villain that Luffy hates the most, then Blackbeard is a close runner up here. He's the one who captured Ace and turned him into the government in the first place. Aside from that, he committed the ultimate sin that a pirate can commit and killed one of his crewmates. He killed Whitebeard and somehow managed to steal his own devil fruit, and Luffy surely won't be happy when he hears that Blackbeard actually defeated Law either. And somehow Teach even gave Shanks the scars across his eyes. So despite all that we know about Blackbeard, he is still ultimately a mystery. Tons of unanswered questions about his backstory, his powers, and his goal that we still need answers for. What we do know though is that he's kind of like a dark reflection of Luffy. When Blackbeard is introduced during Jaya, they are clearly at odds with each other. Teach loves the bar's cherry pies while Luffy hates them. However, both of them fiercely believe in the idea of dreams. Both of them have a very clear goal and dream of becoming the king of pirates, but go about it in quite opposite ways. While Luffy is following in the footsteps of Goldie Roger, Blackbeard appears to be inspired by Rox D. Zebek. He even named his ship the Saber of Zebek and created his base on Pirate Island, where Rox used to be as well. Luffy is the sun god, whereas Blackbeard ate the darkness fruit. Luffy spreads freedom and liberation to others, and Blackbeard, to be fair, offers freedom to those beneath him as well, but one that is underpinned by chaos and violence. Luffy, of course, faces his obstacles head on with a lot of courage, whereas Blackbeard is strategic and has no problem making a tactical retreat. Luffy wants to reach Laugh Tale to become the Pirate King, while Blackbeard seems to want to become Pirate King in the very literal sense by trying to make his island a member nation of the world government. And so really only one thing is for sure here. One day, Blackbeard and Luffy are just fated to go head to head for the title of King of the Pirates. And if Blackbeard is one of the greatest villains in all of One Piece, then our next villain is not. Hody Jones had all the makings of a okay villain, a revolutionary following in the footsteps of Arlong, who wanted to fight for the Fishman's supremacy. However, it all kind of turned out to be a ploy to satisfy his natural love of violence. And honestly, in quite stark contrast to all the villains with quite complex motivations, this Michael Jackson lookalike ended up just being a villain who was evil for the sake of being evil. And he also, of course, taught us the dangers of relying on performance-enhancing drugs. Don't do drugs, kids. But actually, speaking of drugs, it brings us to the second clown villain on our list, Caesar Clown, who is the gas-using mad scientist who makes his living by performing a highly unethical experiment on children. Now, more than anyone, he kind of feels like a counter to Chopper, who uses his scientific knowledge to heal people. Meanwhile, Caesar creates deadly weapons and toxins, selling them all to the highest bidder. For Big Mom, he experimented with turning children into giants by feeding them special candy. And at that, a quick word to you viewers out there, don't accept any special candy from a guy who looks like this. But yeah, meanwhile, he was also developing SAD, a chemical that was instrumental in our next villain's operation to create artificial devil fruits for yet another villain we're gonna talk about. And that villain is Don Quixote do Flamingo, who's so well connected that I've already had to mention him multiple times during this video. One could say that he has a good web of associates, but yeah, he's the ruler of Dressrosa, and he's also one of the 7 warlords. He's a broker of the criminal underworld known as Joker, and if all of that wasn't enough yet, he's also secretly a celestial dragon. Oh, and of course, he has like the most drip out of any anime character ever. Like, check out the shades, the feather coat. I mean, come on, don't even need to say anything. And kind of like Hody Jones and Rob Lucci, Doflamingo is another one of those, well, bad to the bone, born to be evil kind of characters, but his backstory at least gives him a pretty excellent motivation. As I just mentioned, Don Quixote Doflamingo was born as a world noble, the descendant of one of the 20 families that founded the world government. Shockingly though, his father was one of the probably very few celestial dragons who was actually pretty chill and, you know, decided to move to the surface and leave the comforts of Marijoa. Unfortunately, there he was shocked to find that the people on the surface, for some reason, didn't really like celestial dragons all that much, even if he had given up his title. And so fast forwarding to his wife dying and then him being tortured along with his two sons, Doflamingo and Rocinante. And Doflamingo is then taken in by Treble, who kind of molds him into the terrible man that he became. In fact, Doflamingo even killed his own father with a pistol that Treble gave him as revenge for turning the family's lives upside down. Yeah, talk about a villain origin story, but that wouldn't be the last time that he killed a family member, of course, either, because he also killed his brother Rocinante after finding out that he's been spying on him as an undercover marine. And obviously, in a cast full of manipulative villains, no one fit that role better than Doflamingo, who literally used his string powers to play puppet master to the kingdom of Dressrosa. He basically answers the question of what would have happened if Crocodile's plan had actually worked out, having taken his place on the throne of the Don Quixote family's ancestral home by corroding the public trust in the King Riku. He basically thought of himself as a god with a claim over the entire world, but Luffy put him in his place when he slammed him from the heavens and right down into the ground. As far as we know, right now he's actually spending time in a prison cell, but it's only a matter of time before we will see him again. I'm pretty sure of that. Because, for example, Jack here tried and failed to break Dofi out of captivity in between his attacks on Zou. And Oda sure seemed to be hyping him up, and he was technically the main villain of the Zou arc, but he was kind of a mammoth disappointment, if you get my drift here. Because after he got clowned on in Wano and basically off-screen for the rest of the arc, it doesn't really seem like somebody I need to spend a whole time talking about in this video. Who we do have to actually talk about, though, is of course Big Mom, because as one of the 4 emperors, Big Mom commands not just the power of a crew, but power equivalent to that of a whole nation, with a military presence to match that of a country. And beyond just her own country of Totland, she also lays claims to many islands under her protection, such as Fishman Island, at least until Luffy took it as his own. And of course, in a story jam-packed with truly dark backstories, hers might honestly just be the darkest. First off, Big Mom was abandoned as a child by her parents and left on Elbaf so that, she could pick on someone her own size. And it wasn't long until she then found herself in the care of Mother Caramel, a nun/child trafficker, and everyone was terrified of her insane amount of strength, even as a child, but at least she had friends to celebrate her birthday with. Unfortunately, during her birthday celebrations, she was so enraptured by the delicious food there that she ate it all up along with everyone she ever loved. But hey, I mean, at least she got one of the most overpowered devil fruits in the series out of it, so she got that going for her. Basically, Big Mom's soul fruit powers let her manipulate the very essence of life itself. Everyone who lives in Totland literally pays for their safety with their own lifespan, offering up bits of their soul, which in turn help Big Mom achieve even greater power. And with this power, she creates a whimsical fairy tale land where everything is alive and singing songs, and it's not scary or unnerving at all that the trees and teacups and everything in between is watching your every move and singing to it. To be fair though, she does dream of creating a beautiful world where people of every race can live in harmony and, sit at the same table. It's just that they'd better be sitting eye level with her, and she had better be the one in charge of all of that. So that is a little bit of a smudge on that entire dream. But of course, this emphasis on control doesn't end with objects. It applies particularly to her own insane family. You see, the majority of her crew's heavy hitters come from her 85 kids. I mean, low-key, honestly, she looks pretty good for a mother of 85 children. And as much as I'd like to talk about all of these kids, each single one, I've got my eye on just one particular one for this video, and that is Katakuri. You see, certified donut lover Katakuri is Big Mom's strongest son and one of her so-called sweet commanders. And even though technically he's not the main villain of the Whole Cake Island arc, he is the one that Luffy fights against, so he definitely does deserve a spot on this video. Now, as we find out, Big Mom is quite abusive towards her children, going on temper tantrums and hunting them or draining their life force. However, all of the Charlotte siblings have one protector, and that is Charlotte Katakuri. According to his Weaver card, as a young child, he loved eating donuts and once opened his jaw so far that permanently it ended up scarring his mouth, which, you know, some bullies then made fun of him for. After he retaliated, the bullies permanently scarred his little sister Brulee's face, and now to protect his family, he covers his own with a scarf at all times. Supposedly, his back has never touched the floor, and he always projects an image of true strength and utter coolness, even though in private he actually still loves to lay back with a tasty donut. And once again, Katakuri is one of those antagonists who's kind of held up as a mirror to Luffy, not only because they fight in the mirror worlds. Both men are goofy, even if Katakuri tries to hide it, but get serious when it comes to protecting the people they love. Both have quite stretchy powers, with Katakuri's mochi fruit basically giving him Luffy's rubbery powers and then some. In fact, Oda even sets their fight in the mirror world, hammering in the idea that these fighters are like reflections of one another. Now, over the course of the fight, Luffy has to learn Future Sight Haki, an ability that Katakuri has mastered that allows him to see 5 seconds into the future, but by the end of the battle, Katakuri comes to truly respect Luffy, and now that Big Mom is out of the picture, it's very likely that once again he might be a person joining Luffy as an ally at some point in the future of the series. And then after Whole Cake Island, it was finally time for Luffy to take down a member of the 4 Emperors, and that pirate was Kaido, captain of the Beast Pirates, also known as the world's strongest creature, who was born with incredible natural strength as a member of the Oni race. Now, back in the days, he was actually a child soldier for his home in the Vodka Kingdom, but eventually became too much for them to control, being drafted into service with the Marines before then breaking free for a life of piracy. At some point, he joined the infamous Rocks crew, where Big Mom gave him the fish fruit model Azure Dragon back on God Valley. He was actually recaptured by the military multiple times and then at some point experimented on Punk Hazard, but he broke free and took King with him, starting his own pirate crew. Kaido then made his base of operation on Wano, partnering with Orochi to take over the country. He hoarded the food of the country for his own people while spoiling its natural beauty by creating weapons factories that polluted the entire environment. Funnily enough, when we first meet Kaido, he's actually attempting to commit suicide by jumping off a sky island, which causes him literally 0 damage. You see, he just can't die no matter how hard he tries. In other words, Kaido is clearly depressed, an alcoholic with a hobby of suicide attempts, with multiple executions, battles, and prison sentences failing to kill him. And that guy honestly should cut down a little bit and drink fewer vats of sake, because that depressant is not good for his mental health, clearly. And honestly, he clearly can't even hold his liquor very well, going on destructive drunken rampages across the country. The man will literally enact the new Onigashima plan completely drunk instead of, you know, going to therapy or something. All his life, he's basically longed for a worthy opponent in battle. He basically had found that rival in Kozuki Oden, the only man ever able to scar him, but that battle was interrupted and he won it unfairly. And then he finally met his match in Luffy, who was the Joy Boy that legend said would eventually appear in Wano. King believed that Kaido could be the return of Joy Boy himself, but Kaido in the end believed that Joy Boy would be the one to bring him down, and in the end, he was completely right. Next, after Wano, Egghead Island kicked off One Piece's long-awaited final saga, and the heads of the world government finally came into view as the major antagonists of the series. After seeing the 5 Elder Stars within Pangaea Castle numerous times all the way back since the Jaya arc, we finally learned the names of all these leaders of the world government. And Saint J. Garcia Saturn in particular descended to the surface to ensure the raid against Dr. Vegapunk would be successful. As the world government minister of science, it turned out that he was the one behind Kuma's transformation into a mindless cyborg. And when we finally learned about Kuma's backstory, it turned out that Saturn was also the one abducting his love Ginny, and his experimentations on Bonnie were the reason for her aging powers. However, he's not just a wicked scientist, he also possesses either a powerful mythical devil fruit or just straight up devil powers, which lets him grow the legs of a giant spider demon and the horns of a bull. His powers also let him pin people down to the ground with a strong gravity-like force, regenerate from wounds, and if I'm seeing this correctly, blow up people's heads. So yeah, Oda is getting real with the final final bosses of the series. But of course, we can only assume that Saturn is really nothing compared to the true big final boss, the secret ruler of the world government who sits upon the empty throne, Imu. Of course, Imu still remains a complete mystery to the fanbase, only being seen in silhouette, unless that's just literally what they look like, I guess. However, what we do know for a fact is that Imu has the terrifying powers to wipe out an entire island of the map. Whether that be an ancient weapon or some other insane, mysterious ability, all we do know for sure is that we're in for the battle of the century when the king of the world finally goes head to head with the king of the pirates. And actually wondering about the true identity of Imu is only one of the mysteries that One Piece fans are speculating about to this day. There is so much lore about the Void Century, Sun God Nika, and wow, I mean, we already have a whole lot of the puzzle pieces, and you can actually see everything that we do know about the lore of One Piece in this massive iceberg right here that contains everything that we know so far. Thanks so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe. It really ends up helping the channel, even if it's annoying. And otherwise, I do hope to see you in this video next.